Hello, scholars. Today we're going to talk about our Chapter 5, which is entitled Social Interactions, Groups, and Social Structure. This is a really important chapter. It's Chapter 5 in our textbook. It's an important chapter because it really explains how society is structured and the different roles that people have and different statuses and the importance of all that. So we're going to talk about all of these different concepts. And of course, we'll look at them from three sociological perspectives. But just to kind of give you a heads up, if we think about the structural functionalist approach, they're all about how society is structured, right? And how things function, how things benefit society. So, of course, they're going to have a lot to say about this chapter. The conflict perspective is going to be kind of critical of the way that society is structured because their viewpoint is that society is structured in a way to maintain the status quo so that those people who have high status maintain that status and the people below them stay below them so that they feel elevated and feel maybe a little better than the working classes or the lower classes, people of lower status. We're going to talk about social interactions, and we're going to talk about all the different roles and statuses that you occupy. I think it's a great chapter. It's a very important chapter in understanding how society gets put together in the way that it does and what holds it together, the glue. Durkheim has his ideas about what holds society together. Ferdinand Tönnies also has some ideas about what structures society in the way that it's structured. So let's jump into the chapter. We're going to start out with a couple of very basic definitions. Social interaction is defined as the ways in which people respond to one another, whether face-to-face or over the telephone or on the computer. Those are new additions to the definition because there was a time when people didn't really interact with each other that much, even over the telephone. Telephone calls initially in the old days were for a purpose. You called someone to share information or to ask them to do something, or there was a purpose behind calling. But today, calling someone on the telephone might be recreational. It might be to maintain the relationship. You need to have phone conversations every now and then to touch base and check in with your friends and other people that are in your social network. Okay. And of course, today, with smartphones and everybody using the internet for so many various things, we've included that in the definition of social interaction because certainly people are interacting with each other through these new technologies. Okay. And then social structure is defined as the way in which society is organized into predictable relationships. Human beings crave predictability. We need a certain amount of sameness in order to understand how we get through the day each day. If one day the rule was that when you come to a four-way stop, the person to the right goes first, and then the next day we change the rule, that would create mass confusion. So just think about how the pandemic has upset your lives and the lives of the people around you. Perhaps your job has been in danger as a result of the pandemic, or perhaps you've even lost your job, or you may know people that have lost their jobs and how that throws them into chaos. Now they're wondering, how am I going to pay the bills? How am I going to put food on the table? How am I going to get a new job when the economy is really beginning to suffer? And to be honest with you guys, I really think that the worst economic problems from the pandemic are yet to come. The airlines and a number of other industries, tourist industries and things of that nature, are really, really hurting right now. The hotel and motel industry, lodging, there's a lot of uncertainty there. People in New York City are buying cars for the first time in many, many years because they feel uncomfortable with public transportation. So when you upset this social structure that kind of gives us an idea of how we're supposed to behave and how we're supposed to interact with each other, it can be very discomforting to human beings. We want a certain amount of predictability. Now, if things get too predictable, then we think it's boring, right? So we need some stimulation, but we also need structure. We need to know that in the morning we're going to get up and go to work and work in our workplace. We're going to go to lunch with our work buddies. We're going to have all these social networks and social interactions with our coworkers and our friends. And then we're going to go home and we're going to have our home life there. And there's some predictability there, hopefully, as well. We expect that our significant other is going to do certain household chores while we do other household chores. And if that predictability is upset, it can be disconcerting and discomforting to us as human beings. So social structure is really, really important, and social structure is all around us, but we don't really see it. It's kind of a forest for the trees thing. We're so focused on the forest that we don't see all the trees. We're so focused on living our lives that we don't see how social structure influences us until that structure is ripped. The fabric of society gets ripped, as in this pandemic, where, I certainly love teaching and love the face-to-face interaction, and I think the online experience is not as good for students, and it's certainly not as good for me. To be honest with you, I really thrive in an environment where I'm face-to-face with students and you're asking questions and we're debating different topics and thinking about things, and really, to me, that's exciting, and it's fun to see students, figure things out and have the light bulb come on. And unfortunately, in the online experience, we don't get that. We still get to grade the papers and do the work of teaching a class, but we don't get that interaction. And for me, that's what it's all about. I have actually resisted teaching online until the pandemic hit, because I really crave that student instructor interaction that makes me feel like, hey, there's something really happening here, and the students are getting it, or if they're not getting it here, let me help them get it. And when we do this online, it's it's uncomfortable for a lot of our students, and it's uncomfortable for faculty. But right now, it's the safest route to go. So, social structure is really, really important, and it's all around us, even though we may not see it until, like I said, until something happens to disrupt it. And then it becomes very, very clear how important social structure is. So reality is shaped by our perceptions, our evaluations, and our definitions. So what this means is that we all have slightly different but very similar reactions to what we define as reality. And so, reality has an objective component, but then it also is influenced by the way we see things. So if we see two people arguing, we might interpret that as, oh, well, there's a couple who are having a domestic problem. But if we get closer to it, we might see that they're not a couple at all. They're just two people who happen to come in contact with each other and had a disagreement. And so that might have been, our perception of that might have been influenced by the fact that we grew up in a home where mom and dad were arguing a lot, and so the meanings that we attach to different behaviors are very important. And because we all grew up in similar settings, even though maybe we're in a different subculture, we might even be in a different country, there are some commonalities between different cultures, but there are also some cultural variations, right? And those cultural variations can certainly influence how we interpret events, how we define things, and how we perceive those events. So social reality is literally constructed from our social interactions. If we've interacted with people in a particular way, for example, let's say that we grow up in a family where everybody really works together and there's a real understanding that the family unit is important and that everybody has to play a role in getting the housework done. You know, if you're in a large family and you've got a lot of kids and there's a lot of laundry and meals to be cooked and housekeeping to be done, but everybody pitches in without griping, and it's a real cooperative effort. You may grow up thinking that that's kind of what family life is all about, and then you come into contact with somebody who came from a very different kind of family, and they may do things radically differently, and they may yell at each other. And you know, when I grew up, my parents never yelled at each other, never argued in front of the kids, and so I grew up kind of thinking that that's what family was like, you know. And then when I started dating and getting into serious relationships, I found out that, well, some people grew up in environments where there was a lot of yelling, and somebody yelling didn't mean that they didn't love you. It just meant they were expressing their feelings in a way that they grew up seeing their parents express their feelings. And so the first time I was in a serious relationship and my girlfriend raised her voice, I thought, well, gosh, we're breaking up. You know, I didn't know that people could argue and still get along and work it out and maintain the relationship, because I never saw that with my own parents, who are still married. So I tell my students that I grew up in a Beaver Cleaver existence, and that used to mean something to my students. They knew who Beaver Cleaver was. Today, unfortunately, most of my students don't know who Beaver Cleaver was. But if you get a chance, go on YouTube, watch an episode, maybe the pilot of Leave It to Beaver. It was a story from the 1950s that really got a lot of airplay during the 60s and 70s, about a little boy and his brother and their kind of nuclear family, with dad going off to work and mom doing household chores, wearing her pearls, and vacuuming the house and cleaning and cooking. Oh, you never saw her doing any of that stuff, but you knew she did. I shouldn't say never saw her doing it. Occasionally she'd be cooking a meal or something, or she'd be dusting a little bit. But, she played a very traditional female role at that time of being a homemaker and the caretaker for the children, while Dad, Ward Cleaver, went out and earned the money. So, Beaver would get into occasional problems and, do things that his parents disapproved of and get into a little trouble, but it was all, very sweet and it was all resolved in 30 minutes. All the problems were resolved in a half-hour show. It was a great show, but and it showed a part of American life, but most American families were not like that. That was kind of the image that it was creating, was that, hey, this is what American families are supposed to be like. And the reality is that most American families were not a lot like that. But we could all identify with it. That was something that we aspired to have, was a nice little family in a very beautiful home with a manicured lawn, and dad going off to work and mom doing the household chores, and the kids, being pretty good kids, but maybe a little mischievous and occasionally getting into little minor scrapes, but never anything real serious, So I kind of grew up, unlike most of my friends, I actually kind of grew up in a Beaver Cleaver family, because there was no substance abuse or violence or abuse from my parents, no arguing between my parents, no, prolonged periods of unemployment and economic uncertainty. I really was a very, very fortunate kid in that my childhood was about as good as you could hope for, about as positive as you could hope for, generally speaking. So that didn't really prepare me for the real world, to be honest with you, because when you get out into the real world and you realize that people have problems and issues and things, sometimes you're not well equipped to deal with some of those things. So let's talk a little bit about social interaction and reality. We're going to kind of explore the nature of social interaction and what constitutes reality. And their text notes that varies across culture, as I've already mentioned. when you grow up in different cultures or different subcultures, you get a different view of the world. You get a different perspective of things. So, for example, your text points out that in Western cultures, we tend to see marriage as a relationship and a social status, but the focus is really on the relationship, right? Yes, I'm a married person. I'm a husband. I'm a father. But, the relationships, what's really, really important there. In Japan, marriage is considered more of a social status. And so you get status by being a married person, and you get status from the person to whom you're married. So if your spouse is someone with a lot of status and power, then you benefit from that. Okay. The ability to define reality, social reality, reflects a group's power within a society. So if your view is that drinking alcohol is acceptable once an individual becomes 21, but marijuana and other illicit substances are wrong because that's the home life that you grew up in. That's been the dominant group for many years. That's been the dominant perspective on different substances in our history. But we see today with the younger people being more accepting of marijuana use, and states beginning to reflect that by changing their laws and allowing medicinal marijuana use or recreational marijuana use. We're seeing that that's changing, right? And so our culture is changing, and all cultures change and evolve over time. Sometimes the changes are very slow, but sometimes they can be pretty abrupt. The change in regards to our attitudes about marijuana have been pretty slow, to be honest with you. The National Organization for Repeal of Marijuana Laws, NORML, has been attempting to move towards legalization for many years now. I remember NORML being vocal back in the 1970s and 80s when I was a teenager, trying to reduce the penalties for a substance that objectively is not nearly as harmful as things like tobacco and alcohol. Okay. Now, I just want to point out, I'm not saying that that marijuana does not have some problems associated with it. We know that there's memory loss. We know that there's lung damage. There have been suggestions that people with mental illness who are chronic marijuana smokers or users can have psychotic episodes triggered by the use. There are some concerns about chromosome damage. And so unfortunately, a lot of the harms associated with marijuana are probably not discovered at this point because we labeled marijuana a Schedule 1 drug, which means that there's been very little research on either the benefits or the problems associated with marijuana use. So we haven't done a tremendous amount of research, and even when we have done research on the use of marijuana and its impact on people, it's not been very good research, to be honest with you. We need more comprehensive research into the effects of THC and other chemicals in marijuana in order to really understand it. But as long as it's a Schedule 1 narcotic, that's going to be difficult to do. But what we do know is that alcohol and tobacco clearly have significant negative impacts on health, and much more obvious negative impacts on health than marijuana does. And so there are some problems with marijuana. We know that there's impaired judgment. People who are driving under the influence are more at risk of having an accident and things of that nature. But the harms that are associated with marijuana are not the harms that people tried to put on it in the 1930s when marijuana was legal and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics was trying to criminalize marijuana use. They talked about reefer madness, and they talked about people going insane and killing their whole families with an axe because they smoked a couple of marijuana cigarettes. And that's just not reality. That was a subjective harms, not an objective harms. So objective harms have to do with things that you can actually document document through research that, hey, this is what happens. Subjective harms are harms that are associated with a substance that in fact may not be true. They're believed to be true, but it hasn't been demonstrated and hasn't been proven that those things are true. So some of the subjective harms of marijuana use, that people would go insane and kill their families and things of that nature, that people would descend into moral decay and engage in promiscuous sex and all, violence and all this kind of stuff. If you've ever seen the movie Reefer Madness, that was actually made as a docudrama. But if you watch that movie, you'll quickly learn that, yeah, that's probably not very realistic. I know people who've used marijuana and they don't act like these people. And it's really kind of a comedy, a cult comedy today, because it's so crazy, some of the things that they attribute to marijuana use. So, again, I'm not saying that marijuana doesn't have any harms associated with it. I'm saying that many of the harms are not the harms that have been attributed to it in the past, that those have not been objectively proven. So, the subculture that you grow up in will influence how you perceive drug use and things of that nature. It will influence how you perceive almost everything. Okay? So, we're going to talk about 5 different elements of social structure. These are all very important, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about all of them. The first one is statuses, and there are certain statuses that you're born with, and there are statuses that you achieve in your lifetime, and we'll talk about these ascribed and achieved statuses. We'll talk about social roles. You guys know about social roles because you play a lot of different social roles. Sometimes you have to play the role of child to your parents. If your parents become ill and you have to go and take them to the doctor and look after them and maybe take groceries to them for a few days until they get back on their feet or whatever, the role of child, adult child in that situation is very important. But if you have children of your own, you may have the role of being a parent. And being a parent, is a very important role that has a lot of responsibilities attached to it. And so some people are dealing with their parents while they're aging and starting to encounter some difficulties at the same time that they're also raising their children, and they've got teenage kids in the house, and they kind of feel trapped between the two. We call that the sandwich generation. We'll talk more about it in the chapter on family. But sometimes our roles can come in conflict with each other, or there can be role overload. Okay, if you're trying to be a good student and trying to be a good employee and trying to be a good mom or dad and trying to be a good son or daughter to your parents, sometimes that can result in some role overload. There's just so many demands on you that you can't do any of them adequately. Okay. We'll also talk about groups. There are a number of different types of groups. There's primary groups and secondary groups. There's reference groups. These groups have an influence on our behavior and the way we see things. The groups that we belong to. If you join a group that is in favor of limiting the number of guns in society, a gun control lobby group, chances are over a period of time you're going to become more and more focused on trying to pass legislation that will put greater controls on gun ownership in this country. On the other hand, if you join the NRA, you may already have pretty adamant views that gun control is wrong and the Second Amendment should be protected and all of that. But if you join the NRA and you interact with people in the NRA, you're going to become likely to be even more in favor of gun ownership than you were in the past. So by joining groups in which we have an interest, we can grow even more interested and more certain that our view is the right view. Okay. So our groups that we belong to have an impact on us. Think about the groups that you belong to as a kid, and these are sometimes formal groups, and then sometimes they're more informal groups. So, for example, if you join a club, that's a formal organization that has rules, that has admission standards, perhaps, has an application process maybe. And you kind of know what to expect when you join the group. They tell you, here's what you should expect from membership in our club. But groups are also more informal. The neighborhood group that you played with as a child, and then the so-called near groups of teenage groups when you get a little older. Where's the line between a group of youths who play with each other and a gang? Sometimes that line can get a little blurry, right? Sometimes it can be hard to tell if a group is a so-called play group or if they're a gang, because kids who get together and hang out together kind of on an informal basis because they're geographically live close to each other and they enjoy each other's company, they can cross the line into a gang. They're going to do things that they're trying to do for fun and for excitement. Kids love to do things that are exciting. And if they're bored, they're going to look for something to do. And sometimes that can turn into juvenile delinquency, right? So Louis Jablonski talked about how play groups can form into neighborhood gangs at some point. He did that research back in the 1950s. Very prominent sociologist and criminologist who I was lucky enough to do some work with and study under. Okay. We'll talk about networks. Networks are very important because your social network can help you get a job if you lose your job, or if you graduate with your degree and you're starting to look for a job and some of your friends are out there working in the same environment that you want to work in. They can let you know, hey, we've got an opening come up, so you need to apply for this job. I think you'd be good for it. Okay, and it'd be good for you. Social institutions. Social institutions are kind of patterned ways of getting things done in society. So when you think about an institution, we've got the institution of the economy. We are a capitalist economy, and so the economy works by you going out and getting a job and earning wages and paying your bills, and by spending money and paying taxes, you contribute to other people's lives and the well-being of society as a whole. Okay. Other institutions include the government. The government helps to determine who gets what by passing laws, right? So when we create a new program that gives you $1,200 of stimulus money because of the pandemic, the government is saying, hey, we think that these folks are in need, and we're going to give them this one-time payment of $1,200 to help them meet their needs and to keep the economy going and keep society functioning smoothly. So we've got the government, we've got the economy, we've got the workplace. That's part of the economy, but it's a little bit separate as well. We've got our education institutions, we've got our religious institutions, we've got our criminal justice institutions where we have lawyers and judges who determine whether someone committed a crime and prosecute them and determine punishments. We've got the criminal justice system where we have all these different types of corrections. You might get probation, you might get some time in the county jail, you might get a fine, you might get prison time, or you could even be sentenced to death by a judge or a jury if it's a capital offense case, right? And so these are all examples of institutions that have been set up to get things done in society in a kind of systematic way. We kind of know if we're trying to register our vehicle, we kind of know that, hey, you have to go here and you pay this money and they give you your registration and your sticker and all of that. There's a patterned way of getting things done. Now, it's changing, obviously. You can do more and more of it online, right? You don't even have to go to the office and pay your fee there. You can just go online and pay it electronically, and they send you your tags in the mail. But those are the 5 elements of social structure that we're going to talk about: statuses, social roles, groups, social networks, and social institutions. So let's talk about each of these. Now, I mentioned statuses earlier, and I said that some statuses you're born into. You're born male or female, and yes, some exceptions do change from female to male or male to female. But generally speaking, we are born with a certain biology, and for most of us, our biology and our the way we see ourselves are congruent with each other. For example, if you're born male, then you may grow up seeing yourself as a male, identifying as male. Most people there's a congruency between their biological sex and their gender identity, but not for everybody, right? So generally speaking, a person's biological sex or their gender is it's congruent with their sex, and therefore they see themselves as male. I was born male. I see myself as male. That's an ascribed status. It's not something that I achieved. I didn't become male at some point. I was male from birth. I'm white. That's another ascribed status. It's not something that I achieved or anything like that. It's just I was born to parents who were white, and therefore society sees me as white, and I have identified as white. So I'm a white male. I'm I'm a sociologist. That's certainly an achieved status. So that's the difference between ascribed statuses and achieved statuses. An ascribed status is something that you're born into. If you are Persian, from Iran perhaps, if you're Persian, then you were born into that culture, and therefore it's an ascribed status. If you become a physician, that's an achieved status. So these statuses are all very important, and you occupy a number of statuses. You can hold more than one status at a time, obviously. For example, you can be a son or daughter to your parents. You can be a neighbor to your neighbors. You can be a student, or you can be an instructor. You can be a parent. All of those are statuses that you can hold at one time. You can be an employee. Most of us occupy probably 10 or 12 statuses at any given time, because we do a lot of things, and there's a lot of social interaction, and all of those things that we do have a status attached to them. Okay, if you're a reader and you belong to a book club, that's part of one of your statuses. Some statuses are really, really important, and other statuses are a lot less important. If you're a disabled person, that's probably pretty central to your identity. That status can be pretty important to you, and it can impact your life in pretty profound ways. Okay. So I've talked a little bit about ascribed and achieved statuses. Ascribed statuses are generally assigned at birth, as I mentioned. Examples would include your race, ethnicity, gender, and age. And these statuses are significant because there are social meanings attached to them. What does it mean to be a son or a daughter? What does it mean to be a parent? What does it mean to be a college instructor? What does it mean to be a college student? There are responsibilities and roles that go along with every status that we occupy. Even, the thing of being a friend, the status of friend. There are certain expectations that we have of our friends, and if they violate those expectations, they may not remain our friends, right? Achieved statuses are statuses that are earned through one's own efforts. So a lawyer, a social worker, a prisoner, a computer programmer, those are all achieved statuses. A member of the Honor Society, a member of various groups that you might belong to, those are achieved statuses. You did something to make that happen. Statuses can be very complex. They sometimes our ascribed statuses will affect our achieved statuses. For example, if you were African American in this country prior to the Civil War, your ascribed status as being an African American also affected all of your achieved statuses, right? You weren't allowed to achieve things because you might be a slave, and therefore that status, that ascribed status as an African American, an African descendant in America, left you without many opportunities for achieved statuses, right? Certainly, some statuses can be achieved or ascribed, but generally speaking, they're one or the other, right? So if you look at figure 5-1, social statuses, in your textbook, you've got the young lady there in the center, and you've got some ascribed statuses over the top, and then some achieved statuses around the bottom. That's a very good graphic representation of what most of us are like in terms of our statuses that we occupy in society. Sometimes a status is so central to who we are that it becomes what we call a master status. And I can give you some examples of that. Um, I became a sociology instructor over 30 years ago. And in the intervening years, I've done a few other things. For the most part, I've taught sociology, but I also worked in the Office of Institutional Research for, probably about 10 years. But during that whole time that I worked in the Office of Institutional Research, I still saw myself as a sociology instructor. So I was still working in higher education. I wasn't teaching at the time, but I still saw myself. So that's my master status. Sociology instructor, sociologist is really my master status in terms of how I see myself and my career and things of that nature. But there are other master statuses that can be very powerful as well. So if you think about someone who is a former convict, an ex-con, someone who has a criminal record, that may be their master status. And whenever they go and apply for a new job, they see that question, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And if they say yes, they know that that's going to influence how people see them, and it may influence whether they're able to get a job or not. So, that would be a master status. If someone has a severe disability, physical disability, if they're confined to a wheelchair, for example, that may become their master status. It's so important to who they are as a person, and it affects so many areas of their life that's how people identify them. So, master status is defined as a status that dominates other statuses and determines a person's general position in society. Many people find their status as a disabled person receives undue weight. We've started using the term handy-capable because a lot of people who have some kind of disability are capable of doing a lot of things, but in the past, we tended to have the attitude that, oh, well, they're in a wheelchair, they can't work outside the home, they can't expect to go to college and earn a degree. Today, we wouldn't say those kinds of things. We would talk about their capabilities and not the handicaps that might make things harder for them, but that they could still overcome. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about social roles. I mentioned social roles earlier. They're often connected to our statuses. So if your status is child, then the roles are all the expectations that we put on being the child of, adult child of parents. So a social role is simply a set of expectations that are assigned to a particular social position or status. And so, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes we have role conflict or role overload. In this case, let's talk about role conflict. Let's say that you've got a really good friend, and that friend is telling you that they are thinking about doing something criminal and something, So on the one hand, you've got a friendship, and your status as friend says, hey, you should not divulge things that your friend is telling you, secrets that your friend is sharing with you. But on the other hand, as a citizen of the country and as maybe an upstanding person who wants to do the right thing, you want to prevent this person from harming other people in their criminal act, and so you're conflicted. You have role conflict. You've got these two roles, friend but citizen, that are kind of in conflict with each other, and you don't know what to do. For example, let's say that you're an attorney and you've got that strong desire to do the right thing and to report crimes if you see them and to be an officer of the court. Not only that strong desire, but actually, an expectation by the American Bar Association that you're going to be an officer of the court. But your friend is contemplating doing something illegal that could harm other people. That might be an example of role conflict. So, but you can also, as I said earlier, experience role overload, where you've got so many expectations assigned to 2 or 3 of your statuses that you just feel overwhelmed. And so that can be very important as well. It may also be called role strain. Okay. Role strain is defined as the difficulty that arises when the same social position imposes conflicting demands and expectations. People who belong to minority cultures can experience role strain while working in mainstream culture. And so you see there that the person is a minority, a member of a minority group, and sometimes they may be put in positions of conflict because of that minority status when they're out there in mainstream culture. Sometimes people leave roles, we quit our job or we go take a different kind of job. Um, and so we would experience role exit there, the process of disengaging from a role that is central to one's self identity in order to establish a new role and identity. So the business owner, an entrepreneur who decides, you know what, it's not all about making money and getting rich. I think it's time to focus on, creating some positive change in the world. So I'm going to now dedicate my fortune and my efforts to making the world a better place. That would be an example of role exit. Bill Gates experienced that. He felt like, well, gosh, I've got all these millions and millions of dollars. I need to start doing something to really create a better world. And so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was formed, and they've spent millions of dollars trying to create a better world. That might be an example of role exit. I think we often experience, a minister may decide to go and do something else. Someone who's been a lifelong employee in a particular industry may decide, you know what, I want to try to be a stand-up comedian or something like that, or I want to be an artist, or I want, they make pretty significant changes in their lives, and they leave some roles and take up new roles. We have a 4-stage model of role exit. There's doubt. That's when the person is starting to doubt that what they're doing is really valuable to society, and they start thinking about alternatives. And so they search for alternatives. That's step 2. They develop a plan, and so that leads them to stage 3, the action stage or departure, and creation of a new identity. And so it can be difficult to create a new identity. We saw, you guys are too young to remember Cat Stevens, but he was a popular musician in the 70s. And at some point he decided to give up music, and he converted to Islam, and he left the country. And he gave up his music career, a very promising music career. But more recently, he has come back to his music. So he departed the role of musician for many, many years, but now he has come back and started performing again. But he is a radically different person than he was back in the 1970s. Okay. So groups, let's talk about the importance of groups. Groups have a tremendous influence on us. Groups are defined as any number of people with similar norms, values, and expectations who interact with one another on a regular basis. So a play group, some kids that you hang out with, clubs that you join. If you're an athlete and you play summer league baseball, your baseball team is a group. We are impacted by groups on a day-to-day basis. When we get, emails and phone calls asking us to support a particular political candidate, they're asking us to join their group, either the Republicans or the Democrats or Independents or the Green Party or whatever. Those are all groups focusing on politics in that particular situation. Groups play a vital role in society's social structure. If you look at it, the way society is structured, lots of competing groups out there, lots of important stuff happening at that level. Social interaction often takes place within groups and is influenced by their norms and sanctions. So if you belong to a particular group, you probably want to play by their rules, and you should probably be made aware of what those rules are and what the expectations are. Plug my computer in real quick. Okay. Hang on just a second.